I never thought I'd live long enough to feel this kind of betrayal. You see, I'm not a man who startles easy. I've fought through Montana winters that froze the river solid and seen wolves stalk my cattle from the ridge. But nothing cuts colder than the moment you realize your own blood has turned against you. My name's Tom Harrison, and I've lived on this stretch of land just outside Bozeman, Montana, for 72 years. Folks around here call it Harrison Ranch, but to me, it's just home. The house creaks when the wind blows through the pines, and the barn smells of old hay and leather. My wife, Margaret, used to say the place had a heartbeat of its own, steady and calm, like the hum of a man who's worked too hard and learned too much to complain. Margaret passed 3 winters ago. Her death was quiet, peaceful. She just didn't wake up one morning. I buried her under the big cottonwood tree by the creek, the one that blooms white in the spring. I thought after she was gone, the house would stay empty forever. But then, my grandkids started visiting again. At first, it felt like Grace had found me. Ethan, my oldest grandson, showed up with his sister Claire one afternoon, all smiles and hugs. "Grandpa, you shouldn't be out here alone," they said. "We'll help you fix up the place." And I'll admit, it warmed something in me. They were city kids now, all polished and ambitious. But when I saw Ethan hammering boards on the old fence and Claire cooking Margaret's stew recipe in the kitchen, I thought maybe I'd done something right in life. We spent that summer together, long evenings on the porch, laughter echoing across the fields, the sun sinking over the Bitterroot Mountains. For the first time since losing Margaret, I wasn't lonely. Then autumn came, and everything changed. It started small. I caught Ethan whispering in the barn, taking calls he didn't want me to hear. Claire began asking questions about the land title, the will, the paperwork. I laughed it off at first. "You two sound like lawyers," I joked. But their smiles didn't reach their eyes anymore. A week later, I found the letter. It was sitting on my desk in the study, right where I kept Margaret's things. Plain white envelope, no return address, but I knew the handwriting. It was Ethan's. My heart started pounding as I opened it. The words inside nearly stopped it altogether. "Grandpa, we think it's time you moved to town. You're not getting any younger, and the ranch is too much for you." Claire and I spoke with the bank. They're interested in developing the property. We already signed the preliminary agreement. I read it twice, then a third time, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood. But there it was. My own grandkids, selling the land out from under me while I was still alive. That night, the house didn't feel like home anymore. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like betrayal. Every shadow felt like a ghost of Margaret, watching me silently, as if asking why I ever trusted them. The next morning, I drove into town. I didn't tell Ethan or Claire. I just went straight to my lawyer, an old friend named Rick Hanley, who'd handled our family's paperwork for decades. When I handed him the letter, he frowned, then sighed. "Tom," he said carefully, "they've already filed the transfer request with the county. They listed you as having given them power of attorney." My hands started shaking. "That's impossible," I said. Rick looked me dead in the eye. "It's forged, Tom. But they were clever. It'll take time to prove." I walked out of that office feeling like the wind had been knocked out of me. My grandkids, the same kids who'd sat at this kitchen table, who'd listened to my stories about riding horses through the snow, they'd used my love to steal everything I had left. But I didn't raise cattle for 50 years, just to be outsmarted by a couple of greedy kids. They thought they were clever. They thought an old man wouldn't fight back. They were wrong. Because that was the day Grandpa Tom stopped grieving and started planning his revenge. The thing about revenge is, it works best when your enemy thinks you're too broken to lift your head. That's the beauty of getting old. Everyone underestimates you. I spent the next few days pretending nothing had happened. When Ethan came strutting through the kitchen door with that same fake grin, I offered him coffee like always. Claire fussed around the living room, talking about new curtains and how modern the ranch could look after a remodel. I smiled, nodded, and kept my voice steady. Inside, though, I was studying them like a wolf studies its prey. I learned a long time ago that anger is like fire. If you let it burn uncontrolled, it'll destroy everything, even what you love. But if you control it, it becomes power. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the lamp low and pulled out my old leather notebook. I made a list, not of revenge, not yet, but of facts. 1. Ethan and Claire had forged my signature. 2. The bank had already approved a development proposal. 3. They believed I was too old to notice or too weak to fight. Then I added one more line. They forgot who taught them how to lie. See, when you grow up on a Montana ranch, life teaches you things most city folks will never understand. How to read the wind before a storm. How to find a calf lost in the timber by the sound of its mother. How to fix a broken fence with nothing but wire and stubbornness. And above all, how to wait. So I waited. For the next month, I played the part of the confused old man. I let Ethan handle the bills. Claire talked to the bank. I even signed a few documents they brought over, though I signed my name in a way only I could recognize later, a subtle difference in the curve of the T. It was enough to prove forgery when the time came. Meanwhile, I visited my lawyer Rick every Friday. We worked in silence, drafting papers, collecting copies of every document Ethan and Claire touched. He was furious for me, but I told him, "No, Rick, let them think they're winning. The longer this plays out, the deeper they dig their hole. Out here, the autumn wind turns sharp by November. You can smell snow before it falls. It's metallic, clean, and cold enough to sting your nose." That's how I felt whenever I looked at my grandkids now. The love was still there, buried somewhere deep, but it was frozen solid. Then one evening, I overheard something that turned my stomach. They were in the barn. I'd gone out to shut the doors before the wind kicked up, and their voices drifted out through the cracks. Ethan was saying, "Once Grandpa's in the assisted living place, we can finish the sale. The buyer wants the first demolition done by spring." Claire laughed. That same sweet laugh I used to hear when she was a little girl. "He won't even know what's happening," she said. "It's sad, really. But think of the money. We could start over somewhere new." I stood there in the shadows, my breath clouding in the cold. My hand tightened around the doorframe until my knuckles went white. That was the first time in years I felt real hatred, the kind that makes your pulse slow and your vision sharpen. I turned back toward the house, walking slow, steady, deliberate. Inside, I poured myself a glass of Margaret's favorite bourbon and stared at the old family photos above the fireplace. Ethan at age 5, holding a fishing rod bigger than him. Claire in her red mittens, laughing as she tried to catch snowflakes on her tongue. What happened to them? Was it greed, desperation, or had they always been this way, and I was just too blind to see it? Either way, the decision was made. The next morning, I called Rick. "It's time," I told him. "They're about to make their move. I'm going to let them. And when they do, I'll be ready." "Tom," he said, his voice cautious, "what exactly are you planning?" I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Just an old man's insurance policy, but they won't see it coming." And with that, I hung up and walked outside. The snow had started falling, soft and slow, blanketing the fields in white. It looked peaceful, beautiful even, but I knew better. Snow covers everything, even the footprints of those who plan to betray you. When you've spent your whole life working the land, you learn the value of patience. You don't plant a seed and expect it to grow by morning. You water it, watch it, and wait for the right season. My revenge was no different. It was a crop that needed time, and I was more than willing to wait for harvest. Ethan and Claire thought they had everything under control. They started bringing prospective buyers to the ranch, slick men in pressed suits and shiny boots that had never seen mud. I greeted them kindly, offered them coffee, and showed them around like a proud old fool. I could tell they pitied me, thinking I was just another farmer past his prime, unaware his world was being sold out from under him. But what they didn't know was that every handshake, every conversation, every piece of paper they left behind, I documented it all. I recorded dates, times, names. Rick helped me file quiet complaints under my name, each one creating a trail they'd never think to look for until it was too late. And then I made my next move. One afternoon, I called Ethan and Claire into the study. The air smelled like old wood and tobacco, the same room where I'd once read bedtime stories to them. I told them I'd been thinking about their offer. I kept my tone tired, defeated. "You kids might be right," I said softly. "Maybe it's time for me to let go. This ranch deserves someone who can keep it alive." Ethan's face lit up with relief, and Claire actually teared up. "Grandpa, you're making the right choice," she said, squeezing my hand. I forced a smile. But before I go, there's just one thing. I want to transfer all my assets properly. No confusion later on, so I'll need you both to come with me to the bank next week. We'll do this the right way. They agreed instantly. Of course they did. The next few days, they were in the best moods I'd seen all year. Ethan fixed the fence without being asked. Claire cooked breakfast again, humming while she worked. It almost felt like old times. Almost. I caught myself once or twice wishing it could all be real again. But then I'd remember that letter, the forged signature, and the laughter in the barn. No, this wasn't family anymore. This was war. When the day came, I put on my clean flannel, my best hat, and drove us all to the Gallatin County Bank. The winter sun was bright that morning, bouncing off the snow like shards of glass. I could see Ethan's reflection in the window, confident, proud, completely unaware he was walking into his own trap. Inside, we met Martha, the branch manager. She'd been a friend of mine for over 30 years. I'd spoken to her privately the day before. She knew exactly what to do. I pretended to struggle with my paperwork, muttering about forgetting my glasses. Ethan leaned in, ready to help. When he picked up the pen and started to guide my hand, Martha stepped in. "Actually, Mr. Harrison," she said pleasantly, "we'll need to verify signatures today. New federal procedure." Ethan froze. Claire's smile faltered. Martha handed over a stack of forms, and I signed the top one slowly, carefully, my real signature. Then I watched as Ethan and Claire signed theirs on the witness lines, their confidence creeping back. When we were done, Martha nodded politely. "All set," she said. "I'll process these right away." As we walked out, Claire linked her arm through mine. "You'll see, Grandpa. You'll love the new apartment in town." I just smiled. "I'm sure I will, sweetheart." But what she didn't know was that those papers she'd just signed weren't transfer documents. They were legal affidavits, statements acknowledging their role in financial management of the Harrison estate. In other words, proof they'd been handling my affairs, and an open invitation for an audit. By the time the bank called them about the routine review, I'd already moved the ranch's ownership into a private family trust, one they had no access to. The land was now protected by a clause I'd written with Rick. No transfer, sale, or alteration, without the explicit consent of Thomas Harrison or his legal successor, which, upon his death, defaults to the Montana Wildlife Conservancy. If they tried to sell, they'd hit a wall. If they pushed harder, they'd expose themselves. That night, as I sat by the fire with a cup of coffee, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Control, not joy, not satisfaction, but a quiet steadiness deep in my bones. The game had begun, and they were already several moves behind. The only problem was, they didn't take losing very well, because 2 weeks later, something happened that almost shattered my plan, and nearly cost me my life. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass. For a second, I thought it was the wind. It howls through the valleys of Montana like a living thing in winter. But then I heard footsteps, heavy ones, inside the house. The clock read 2:47 a.m. I grabbed my old lantern and eased out of bed, every instinct screaming at me to stay quiet. The hallway was cold. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I caught a whiff of smoke, faint but real. Then I saw it. The flicker of light down by the mudroom. Someone was in my house. I crept closer and saw the back door cracked open, the winter wind swirling snow inside. The lantern light caught the reflection of a gas can sitting by the woodpile, half empty. My stomach turned. Then I heard Ethan's voice, low and sharp. "Claire, just do it. The insurance will cover it. Grandpa will be safe. We'll tell him it was an accident." For a moment I froze where I stood. The words sank in slow, like poison. They weren't just trying to sell the ranch anymore. They were ready to burn it down. I stepped back before they could see me and slipped out the side door, crunching through the snow until I reached the old barn. From there, I could see the soft orange glow inside the kitchen window. The two of them moving around, nervous, whispering, arguing. Claire's face was pale. Ethan was pacing. I don't know how long I stood there in that freezing air, heart pounding in my chest. I thought about calling the sheriff right then and there, but something in me said, Not yet. If I stopped them too early, I'd look like a paranoid old man. If I let them go too far, I'd lose everything. So, I waited. A few minutes later, Ethan stormed out, slamming the screen door behind him. "Fine," he snapped. "Forget it. I'll handle it myself tomorrow." He kicked at the snow and marched toward his truck. Claire stayed behind, her face buried in her hands. I watched the taillights fade down the road, red and angry against the white night. Then I walked back into my house. The smell of gasoline hung in the air. They'd poured it along the baseboards near the pantry, just enough to make it look like faulty wiring could have caused a spark. I stood there, shaking. Part of me wanted to scream. The other part felt hollow. How do you even process something like that? These were my grandkids, Margaret's grandchildren, the same ones she'd held as babies in her arms. But any trace of pity burned away as I cleaned up the mess. I aired out the house, scrubbed the floorboards, and poured the remaining gas back into the can. Then I placed it in plain sight on the porch. If Ethan came back, I wanted him to know I'd seen it. The next morning, he didn't show up. Neither did Claire. For 3 days, the ranch was silent, just the creak of the barn doors and the wind cutting through the pine trees. Then, on the 4th day, I got a letter. No return address again, but I recognized the shaky handwriting this time. It was Claire's. "Grandpa, I'm sorry. Ethan's gone too far. I tried to stop him. He's desperate. The buyers are threatening to pull out unless we finalize the sale. He blames you for everything. Please don't be alone at the ranch this week." I folded that letter slowly, my hand steady as stone. She wanted me afraid. Maybe she meant it as a warning, but to me, it was a sign. The storm was about to break. That night, I called Rick again. "It's time," I told him. "Get the sheriff on standby, but don't tell them why, not yet." He hesitated. "Tom, are you sure? If they're dangerous?" "I know exactly what they are," I said, "and I know exactly what I need to do." When I hung up, I looked around the living room. Every photo, every memory, every piece of Margaret's life was wrapped up in these walls. If they wanted to destroy it, they'd have to come through me first. I loaded my old pickup with a few essentials: clothes, some cash, the land papers, and a little black box I hadn't opened in years. Inside it were photos of Margaret and a small key, the one that opened the old cabin up in the north pasture. That cabin hadn't been used since Ethan was a boy, but I'd kept it stocked just in case. Back then, it was a hunting shelter. Now, it was going to be my stronghold. Before dawn, I drove out there through the falling snow. The cabin stood dark and quiet, hidden between the trees. I lit a fire, sat down, and listened to the distant howl of the wind. Something told me this wasn't over, and I was right. Because the next evening, when I looked out the cabin window, I saw headlights cutting through the dark. 2 of them. They'd come back. But this time, I wasn't the one who was going to get caught by surprise. By the time I saw those headlights crawling up the dirt road, the wind had turned fierce. Snow whipped through the pines, rattling the cabin windows like bones in a can. I killed the lantern, let the dark swallow me whole, and waited. 2 vehicles. One was Ethan's truck. I'd know that rattling exhaust anywhere. The other was an unfamiliar black SUV, the kind city folks drive when they want to look important. Even through the snow, I could see silhouettes inside, 2 men up front, 1 in the back. This wasn't just family anymore. Ethan had brought company. The tires crunched to a stop outside the cabin. Doors slammed. I heard muffled voices. Laughter that didn't belong to anyone who respected this land. Then Ethan's voice cut through the storm. "Grandpa, you up here? Come on out. We need to talk." He tried to sound calm, but I could hear the tension hiding underneath. I didn't answer. Instead, I slipped on my coat and moved quietly to the back window, where I could see the barn about 50 yards away. The snow was piling fast. Every step left a deep print. 3 shadows crossed the porch. One of the strangers kicked the door hard enough to rattle the hinges. "Nobody's home," he said. "You sure this is the old man's place?" "I'm sure," Ethan muttered. "He's got to be here somewhere. He never leaves." That made me smile. He was right. I rarely left. But this time, I wasn't hiding inside my house. I was hunting. I slipped out the back, moving slow, boots sinking deep into the snowdrifts. The wind howled so loud, I could barely hear my own breath. When I reached the barn, I ducked inside and pulled the door shut behind me. It was dark except for the faint glow of the storm filtering through the cracks. I waited there, heart pounding, as the crunch of footsteps approached. The door creaked open again. Ethan stepped in, flashlight in hand. He swept the beam across the stalls, calling my name softly. "Grandpa, look, we just want to talk. You can't live like this. You're not safe out here." The irony nearly made me laugh. Not safe? He was the danger. But I stayed silent. Behind him, one of the men muttered, "This is a waste of time, kid. The old man's probably frozen to death somewhere." Ethan sighed, rubbed his face, and turned toward the door. "Let's check the cabin again." The second they stepped out, I moved. I crossed the barn, pulled open the feed locker, and took out an old flare gun. Hadn't used it since the blizzard of '09. I loaded a single round and tucked it in my coat. I wasn't planning to shoot anyone, but a flare can light up the night like judgment itself when you need to make a point. I circled back through the trees, keeping low, until I could see the cabin again. They were all inside now. The lights from their flashlights flickered against the frosted windows. I could hear them arguing. "Where's the safe, Ethan?" one man barked. "You said the old man kept cash somewhere." My stomach twisted. So, that's what this was really about. The ranch wasn't enough. Now they wanted money too. Ethan's voice trembled. "I told you, it's here somewhere. Just give me a minute." That was my cue. I stepped out of the shadows, raised the flare gun high, and fired straight into the sky. The red light exploded above the cabin, bathing everything in crimson. The snow reflected it back like blood on glass. Inside, I saw silhouettes freeze, confusion, panic. Then I shouted, my voice cutting through the wind, "Ethan, you picked the wrong place to rob, boy." The front door burst open. Ethan stumbled out, squinting against the light. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" "Me," I said, stepping closer. "I'm making sure the sheriff can see exactly where to find you." He looked over his shoulder, realization dawning in his eyes. Behind him, one of the men cursed and ran toward the SUV. "Cops!" Ethan turned back to me, snow whipping through his hair. "You called them?" I smiled. "Days ago?" For a long second, the only sound was the wind. Then tires spun in the snow, the SUV tearing down the road, headlights vanishing into the whiteout. Ethan stood there, shaking, his breath ragged. "Grandpa, you don't understand," he said. "They were pressuring me, threatening us. I didn't know what else to do." "I raised you better than this," I said quietly. "You had choices. You just didn't like any that didn't make you rich." He took a step toward me, hands raised. "Please. I never meant for it to go this far." But the flashing red and blue lights in the distance told me it already had. The sheriff's trucks appeared through the blizzard minutes later. I gave my statement while they cuffed Ethan and led him to the patrol car. Claire arrived soon after, her face pale and wet from tears. She tried to run to him, but I stopped her. "No," I said. "Let them handle it. Maybe this will teach him what I couldn't." The sheriff, a broad man named Jensen, turned to me. "You did the right thing, Tom. We'll take it from here." When they drove away, I stood in the snow until the lights disappeared completely. The storm eased, the air settling into that heavy silence that only comes after chaos. I thought it was over. I thought justice had finally found its way through the snow. But I was wrong again. Because 2 weeks later, I got another letter. This one from the county jail. And what it said would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The letter arrived in the middle of a quiet morning. Snow still on the porch, the coffee just starting to percolate. I almost didn't check the mailbox that day, but something in me said I should. It was a plain white envelope, my name written in shaky pen. The return address was the county detention center. I didn't need to see the name to know who it was from. Ethan. For a long minute, I just stood there at the kitchen counter, holding that envelope. The house was so quiet I could hear the wind pushing against the walls. I didn't want to open it, not after everything, but curiosity has a way of wearing down even the hardest heart. When I finally tore it open, the smell of old paper and ink hit me. The first line made my stomach twist. "Grandpa, I'm sorry, but there's something you don't know." I read it twice before I even moved to the next sentence. "Those men, the ones who came to the cabin, they weren't after your money. They were after the land. The deal Claire signed wasn't just for development. It tied us to something darker. I didn't know until it was too late. The more I read, the colder I felt. They said there's an old oil survey buried in your property deeds. Someone found out the mountain behind the barn sits on a reserve. Millions of dollars, Grandpa. Claire signed over mineral rights without realizing it. They said if I didn't help them find the documents, they'd hurt her. I set the paper down, my hands trembling. The coffee pot hissed behind me, but I couldn't move. Oil, mineral rights, lies and deals made in my family's name. And I hadn't even known. The letter continued. I never wanted to steal from you. I just wanted to keep her safe. But when those men started talking about making you disappear, I panicked. I thought maybe if I played along, I could protect you. That's why I came up there. Not to rob you, to warn you. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wall. Could it be true? Could Ethan, for all his mistakes, have been trying to save me in his own twisted way? I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew something wasn't adding up. The sheriff said those men were gone, vanished after the storm, never caught, no trace. And now Ethan was claiming they'd threatened his sister too? My gut told me one thing. If there was oil under my land, somebody wasn't done yet. I folded the letter back into its envelope and stared out the window toward the mountains. The snow glittered under the weak sun, the peaks sharp and cold against the horizon. That stretch of land had been in our family since my great-grandfather settled it. If someone thought they could take it with a forged paper and a few threats, they didn't know me. That night, I called Sheriff Jensen. You still got those files from the case? I asked. He hesitated. Yeah, why? I need to look at them again. Something doesn't sit right. The next morning, I drove into town, the first time in weeks. The sheriff met me in his office, a cluttered space that smelled like coffee and snowmelt. He pulled a folder from the drawer and handed it over. This is everything we found, mostly financial stuff, bank records, development permits. Your granddaughter signed a few things a couple years back. I flipped through the papers, and there it was, a contract. Montana Ridge Energy, LLC, signed by Claire Peterson, my granddaughter. My throat tightened. She signed this? Jensen nodded. Looks that way. But that company doesn't exist anymore. Folded right after your grandson's arrest. I looked closer. The signature, it wasn't hers. It was close, but the P curled wrong. Too smooth, too practiced. A forgery. Someone had used my family's names to gain access to that land. I thanked Jensen and drove home, my mind spinning. The closer I got to the cabin, the heavier the air felt. Like the mountain itself was waiting for me to understand something. When I pulled into the drive, there was another envelope pinned to my door with a hunting knife. No return address, just one word on the front, written in red marker, stop. For the first time in a long while, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Someone out there still wanted that land, bad enough to threaten me again. I stood there under the gray Montana sky, staring at that knife, and I realized Ethan's arrest hadn't ended this. It had only exposed the beginning of something much bigger. And if they wanted to fight for this land, for my family's name, then they were about to learn just how far an old man could go when you try to bury his bloodline under a mountain of lies. I stood looking at the knife pinned to my door, and I wondered, again, how many times in these few months had my grandchildren forced me to redefine the line between love and hostility? Stop. The word scrawled in blood-red marker was primitive, yet its message was as clear as the winter air. They wanted me to back down. They wanted me to forget about the forged signatures, the attempted arson, the fact my grandson was sitting in jail. They wanted me to sell my land and disappear. But if oil was behind all this, then it wasn't just a family drama anymore. It was a war for a legacy that I had no right to lose. This was my father's land, and his father's, and it was worth far more than the price of its surface. I pulled the knife from the wood, feeling the foreign weight of its handle. It wasn't a ranch knife, not a hunting knife. It was a city knife, just like the men who left it. I walked inside, and the first thing I did was call Rick again. Rick, I need a complete review of every paper you have on Montana Ridge Energy, LLC. My voice was low, like the rumble of a distant storm. Every document Claire signed, I suspect there's oil on my land, and someone's using my grandkids' names to get to it. Rick paused. Then, Tom, are you sure? This is a major play. If there's oil, it could be anyone, from Houston corporations to local heavy hitters. I'm sure, I replied, staring at the red stop on the envelope. And I'm not giving it up. I need you to start drafting a new will. Rick cleared his throat on the other end. What's the purpose of a new will? We just protected the ranch with the trust. What are you planning? I want Ethan and Claire disinherited, completely and irrevocably. No mention, no token gifts, nothing. No inheritance, no possibility of ever gaining control over anything with the Harrison name on it. I spoke slowly, making sure he recorded every word. This wasn't just a penalty. It was my final recognition of their betrayal. They tried to bury me to get the land. Now, I would bury their connection to this family. But Tom, they're your grandkids. Rick still tried to hold me back. They signed papers that allowed my life to be threatened, Rick. Ethan's in jail, and even if his story about warning me is true, he played with fire. Claire, she let it happen. They both proved the price of oil is higher to them than the price of honor. This land will go to the Montana Wildlife Conservancy, outright and unencumbered. That's the last lesson I'll teach them. For the next few days, I worked like an old hunter preparing for winter. I gathered all the forged papers, all the letters, all the evidence. I even took a sample of Claire's handwriting that Rick found in old school albums and sent it to a private lab for comparison against the signatures on the Montana Ridge Energy contracts. I could no longer trust my instinct. I needed proof. I could feel the circle closing in around the ranch. A strange truck parked near the north fence line. Unfamiliar boot prints in the timber. They were getting impatient. The stop on my door was their trap. If I retreated, they won. If I pushed back, they would be forced to show their hand. I decided to take the risk. One evening, I opened the window and listened. The wind carried a faint, barely perceptible scent. Not pine, not snow, but diesel fuel. They were nearby, using heavy equipment. I grabbed my old binoculars and stepped onto the porch. My gaze swept across the familiar outline of the Bitterroot Mountains until I settled on the north slope, past the thick pine forest where our mineral rights began. And there, through the tree line, I saw them. 2 heavy trucks in the bright, unnatural glare of powerful floodlights. They had started drilling. They weren't waiting anymore. My revenge plan, focused on legal nuances and quiet warfare, was suddenly obsolete. They had moved to a direct seizure. I went back inside and found the envelope with the new will that Rick had sent over by courier that morning. I signed it, placing a clear, unmistakable signature under the clause about disinheriting my grandchildren. It was the last link connecting me to them. I crumpled the red stop envelope and threw it into the fire. As the paper turned to ash, I knew it was time for the final act. They wanted my land. They'd get fire. I called Rick. The new will is signed. Now, call Sheriff Jensen and tell him I've discovered illegal drilling on my property. Tell him to get a warrant and head to the north slope. And Rick, tell him to take his time. Why take his time, Tom? It's illegal. His voice was anxious. I looked at the fire consuming the last trace of the warning. Because I want them to finish their meal before the police arrive. I want their work documented, and I want them to know it was all for nothing. They're drilling for oil that already belongs to the Montana Wildlife Conservancy. And with that, I hung up and reached for my old hunting shotgun. There was no more room for lawyers or documents in this game. There was only me, my land, and the law of Montana. Part 8. The Lesson of Old Montana. A winter night in Montana smells of ice, pine sap, and the distant scent of wood smoke. But tonight, as I traversed the north slope, the smell of smoke wasn't from a fireplace. It was from the heavy diesel machinery operating where it didn't belong. I moved slowly, leaving minimum tracks. I wasn't hiding anymore. They knew I was out here, but they didn't know that I had already turned their victory into nothing. When I finally reached the clearing, the sight hit me like a physical blow. My family's earth was churned up, like an old wound. A huge drilling rig towered over the trees, its light blinding, like a city jail searchlight. 4 men were scrambling around it, their faces smeared with oil and urgency. I recognized one of them, the same man who'd argued with Ethan near the cabin. They were completely consumed by the work. They were close. I could see a core sample lying on the ground. a rock section showing signs of oil. They had found what they were looking for, and their greed had silenced any caution. I felt a cold, quiet calm settle over me. They had won the battle, but lost the war. Now, all that remained was to make their defeat public, loud, and expensive. I raised the shotgun, but not to shoot them. I fired into the air, right above the roar of the drilling rig. Blast! The sound tore through the night silence. The men froze for a moment, like deer caught in headlights. "Drop your tools and put your hands up." My voice was low and gravelly, magnified by the night's acoustics. They turned. Their boss, a burly man managing the drill, slowly lowered his wrench. "Harrison, are you crazy, old man?" Firing a gun in the air like some cowboy. "I am Tom Harrison," I said, stepping into the floodlight. My shadow was long and distorted. "And you have just trespassed onto conservation land. Your oil extraction is fully illegal. You were drilling in vain." The boss laughed, a tight, nervous sound. "Conservation?" "We signed all the papers. Your grandkids, Ethan and Claire, sold it all to us. We're operating legally." "No," I replied. "You operated under forgery, and the legal grounds changed this morning." I pulled a folded paper, a copy of the new will, from my coat pocket and threw it into the mud near their feet. "This will doesn't take effect until I'm dead," I said, "but it's proof I knew about your fraudulent schemes. This morning, I officially disinherited Ethan Harrison and Claire Peterson. Not a dime. They will not receive a single penny from the Harrison Ranch." The boss bent down, picked up the paper, and read. The surprise on his face quickly turned to fury. "You think we care about your will? We bought the drilling rights. You can't just—" "I can," I cut him off. "You operated under a contract with a company that doesn't exist, using falsified signatures. Every minute you've spent out here is a felony. And as for the will, that's just the beginning." I looked up at the rig, shining like a beacon. "You thought this was your gold mine? You brought that greed to my land, and now you'll pay for it. Harrison Ranch is now protected by a trust that transfers it to the Montana Wildlife Conservancy upon my death. No sale, no drilling, ever." He crumpled the paper, his eyes burning in the floodlight. "You'll regret this, old man. You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know all I need to know," I said, and just then in the distance I heard the faint growing sound of sirens. Sheriff Jensen and his men hadn't rushed, but they were coming. I saw the boss's jaw drop. He looked at the road, then at me, and then at the rig, which was now not a gold mine, but a crime scene. "Run," I said, feeling strangely at peace. "This is your last chance. When the feds arrive, you'll be in deep trouble, but I'm not going to stop you. Your failure is your escape." And they ran. 4 men, slick, greedy corporate rats, abandoned their rig, their core sample, and their hope for millions, disappearing into the dark pines like the thieves they were. When the sheriff's trucks arrived, I stood alone in the scarred clearing. Jensen stepped out, his face grim. "Tom, what the hell happened out here?" I pointed to the abandoned rig. "Illegal drilling. I warned them. They ran. All the evidence, all the machinery, all the tracks are yours." Jensen looked at the drilling rig. "This is a big one, Tom. You knew exactly what you were doing." "I did what I had to do," I replied. "The land is safe. My legacy, rewritten. The grandkids get nothing." Back home, by the fireplace, I sat watching the flames. The decision to disinherit Ethan and Claire was the hardest. It was the final verdict. I had cut the last thread. They may have lost the land because of greed, but they lost the family because of betrayal. The snow kept falling outside. This night was cold, but for the first time in months, my house felt like it was breathing peace again. The game was over, but I knew that with Ethan in jail and Claire left alone to face the wrath of powerful men, this wasn't a happy ending. It was only a just ending for an old man who could no longer let love blind him. My revenge was complete. It was the only legacy they had left for themselves. I walked onto the north slope, not hiding, but advancing like a judge. The winter night was torn in half by a bright, unnatural light. The drilling rig stood over my land like a hostile monument. 4 figures scrambled around it, the air thick with the smell of diesel and oil greed. They weren't waiting anymore. They were digging. I raised my old shotgun and fired a single round into the sky. Blast! The thunder rolled down the slope. The work stopped instantly. "That's enough!" My voice was heavy, like ice. "I'm Tom Harrison. You are trespassers." The burly man leading the crew turned, his face smeared and angry. "Harrison? Are you crazy? We're legal. Your grandkids sold us the rights." "They sold nothing," I said, stepping into the floodlights so they could see who stopped them. I pulled a copy of the signed new will from my pocket and threw it onto the muddy ground. "Your contracts are fraud, obtained with forged signatures. But that's not even your biggest problem." The boss bent down, picked up the paper, and read. "A will? You think that stops us?" "No," I replied, letting my voice become perfectly calm. "The conservation law stops you. This morning, while you were digging this hole, I officially disinherited Ethan and Claire. No inheritance. Upon my death, the land passes to the Montana Wildlife Conservancy. You were drilling in a conservation area. Every minute here is a felony committed for nothing." His rage was like a frozen avalanche. He understood. I hadn't just protected the land. I had rendered their victory meaningless. Their failure would be documented. "You'll regret this, old man," he spat. "I already do," I countered, thinking of Margaret and her faith in them. "I regret not doing it sooner." Just then, in the distance, against the backdrop of the snowy woods, flashing blue and red lights appeared. Sheriff Jensen was arriving. I felt the tension drain from my shoulders. The game was over. "That's your last chance," I told the drillers. They needed no encouragement. They abandoned their costly equipment and vanished into the darkness like shadows. When Jensen stepped out of his car, he shook his head, looking at the scarred earth and the rig. "You knew what you were doing, Tom." "I did what I had to," I replied, feeling the weight of the years. "The land is safe, and my grandchildren got what they earned, nothing." I looked at the spot where the rig stood. The oil beneath the ground was real, and it made Ethan and Claire's betrayal all the more bitter. But I had ensured their greed wouldn't become their legacy. It was a cold, but just end for a family that had destroyed itself.